Hello and welcome to the FATBOSS guide to Uu'nat, Harbinger of the Void.
Yes, this three-phase boss is arguably less difficult than the first boss in the instance, as he uses a fair amount of mechanics from that encounter, which by this point you have already learnt. He does however have a relatively nasty last phase which can become messy fast without some big damage from your raid. Anyway, let's jump straight into phase 1.
So before you pull the boss, you'll notice 3 relics, one for DPS, one for a healer and one for your tanks. Make sure you pick them up on the pull, you're going to need to use them throughout the fight. Now during phase 1 you'll want to tank the boss around the edges of the room, and the raid should stack loosely as close to the edges as possible. Throughout the fight the boss will spawn oblivion tears underneath random players. Getting hit by one of these patches deals a small amount of damage and knocks you back, but worst of all it will heal the boss for 1% of his maximum health, so you must avoid these at all costs. Standing at the edges of the room will greatly reduce the chances that someone is going to run into them, mainly because of the gift of N'Zoth. At full energy, the boss will cast this ability, which deals a burst of damage to the entire raid and creates a ring of void on the outside of the room. Standing in this void deals pretty high ticking damage. As this phase goes on, this ability is cast multiple times, making your play area smaller and smaller. By baiting the oblivion tears around the edges of the room, they're eventually going to get covered with a void, meaning that you won't even have to try and dodge them. For tanks in this phase, you have to watch out for the touch at the end. This cone deals a moderate amount of shadow damage and debuffs the initial player for 30 seconds with a light ticking dot. Whilst under the effect of this debuff, it also causes all undying adds to fixate you. These adds spawn one at a time out of the void. They do nothing at all but melee hit you. You do however need to make sure that you tank them at least 10 yards away from the boss, as otherwise he'll take 99% less damage. Now these adds cannot be killed by normal means, as once they hit 1 health, they'll begin to regenerate back again. DPS should multi-dot and cleave them throughout this phase if they can, as the lower the health they have, the less damage they deal, but it's not that important. Whenever your touch the end debuff times out, a new one will be applied to the other tank. It's at this point where you'll need to do a tank swap. Now for the entire raid to watch out for is the Void Crash circles. This works just like it does on the first boss. It's a large targeting zone that reduces each time it bounces to a maximum of 2. It does however on this boss do far more damage, so it's important that you let it bounce at least once before deciding to soak it. Last to mention for this phase is the Eyes of N'Zoth. The piercing eyes spawn in 2 different locations within the room, and then send a beam to the opposite side as they slowly move across the room. Getting hit by the beam applies a short-lived dot. The idea here is that you go through one beam as soon as you can, giving enough time for the dot to drop afterwards before moving through the next. If you go through both beams too quickly, you'll gain 2 stacks of the dot, which will force healers to spot heal you. To make it even easier for your healers, you can actually blink over these beams, avoiding the dot completely. As for the maddening eyes, they'll cover a section of the room in void. Shortly afterwards, any players still stood within it will take a moderate burst of damage and become hostile to allies for 8 seconds. You have plenty of time to move from it, so make sure you do so. Once you've dealt with all of that and got the boss to 70% health, you'll have a very brief transition.
It's at this point you'll want to swap to any of the undying adds and use the DPS relic. When this is used, this will deal ticking damage to the raid and any adds over 15 seconds, and if it deals damage to any player or add underneath 25% health, it will instantly kill them, so you need to make sure you keep people topped up whilst this relic is being used. Now this relic will also stop any on-death effects from the adds, and once the relic is finished, the player who used it will be debuffed, preventing them from using it again for 2 minutes, and it will drop on the ground and begin to charge. This can be seen on the boss frames. It takes 30 seconds to charge, at which point a new DPS can pick it up, ready to use it again. Now after the first DPS relic, you may also want to use the healer relic. This makes the entire raid and any enemies, even including the boss, completely immune to healing, allowing you to soak any of the oblivion tears from phase 1. The healer that used the relic will need to take damage to remove an absorb shield placed on them to remove the effect. This isn't really possible just with oblivion tears alone, and instead you'll need to use the void on the outskirts of the room. Just be quick to move out of it once the relic has been removed. The relic can then be picked up by a new healer once it's finished charging, which takes 60 seconds. Now once that's been dealt with, you'll now be in phase 2. In this phase you'll still have the touch of the end and the undying adds as well as oblivion tears, so you want to continue standing around the edges of the room when you can. To watch out for, what's new is the unknowable terror. This spawns a massive targeting circle on one side of the room. Any players caught in this take a large burst of damage and will be feared. You've got time to move from it, so make sure you're fast. Also to deal with is the new adds. Every 60 seconds or so, mindbenders will spawn. These can be gripped, stunned, and most importantly interrupted as they chaincast consume essence. This cast will do a burst of damage to the whole raid and heal the mindbender back to 100% health. The moment the adds spawn, you want to get them together and AoE them down whilst interrupting every cast. When they die, void spawns will erupt out of their corpses. These adds explode upon death, dealing unavoidable raid damage, pretty much one-shotting the raid if you decide to AoE them down all simultaneously. This is where you want to use the DPS relic again, to stop their on-death effects. Whilst it can be used on the Mindbenders to stop them from spawning the Void Spawns, we found it was best to instead to spawn the Void Spawns and bring any Undying adds underneath them and nuke the Undying adds whilst the DPS relic is cast, clearing all of the adds from the fight. It's important that all of this is done pretty quickly, as the boss has changed his Gift of N'Zoth cast to Hysteria. Instead of increasing the size of the void circle around the edges of the room, he'll instead heal all adds for a shitload and give them a permanent 50% haste and movement speed increase. If you're fast enough, this should never overlap with any active adds. Once you've got the hang of that and you've got the boss to 45% health, he'll transition for the final time. Ideally, you want to push this transition without any adds up. We decided not to do that because we're lazy and we didn't want to stop DPS, but it's not great because you'll be going into the last phase with the DPS relic active on the raid, which makes you deal 50% less damage whilst it's up. On the transition again, like the first, you may want to use the healing relic for a final time to clear up any Oblivion tear patches, but if the majority of the room is already clear, it's not a big deal.
So this final phase is a race against time. The boss will still have his Touch at the End cast and will still spawn the Undying Guardians, and he'll still spawn the Oblivion Tears. He'll also bring the Piercing Eyes back from phase 1 with the beams. But what's new is the Insatiable Torment. This permanent debuff is applied to more and more players throughout the phase. This makes you completely immune to healing. There is however a small targeting circle around you that will leech health from other players that stand within it. The strategy here is just to stack in melee. That way players with a debuff will always have someone to steal health from, whilst healers can efficiently heal back what was stolen. And whilst doing that you still need to move from the Oblivion Tears and any Piercing Eyes that spawn. The only downside of this strategy is the boss's Gift of N'Zoth cast, which is now Lunacy. This deals a moderate burst of raid-wide damage and then causes all players to become hostile to each other for 4 seconds. This is sketchy as hell as cleave damage becomes super dangerous. There is nothing stopping you from killing your entire raid here with dots and melee cleave, aside from your own discipline to just stop your DPS rotation. And if that doesn't work, then you can just use AoE stuns, that way your raid can't kill each other. But jokes aside, don't kill each other, and tanks should use cooldowns as you're not going to be receiving any direct healing for at least 4 seconds. Towards the end of the fight, you'll want to start using personal and raid-wide damage reduction cooldowns on these gift casts, especially if you're a player with the Insatiable Torment debuff. And for the very last cast, if you want, you can use the Tank Relic. And the reason why we say the last cast is that it's actually really hard to break the bubble. 75% of damage that players take is redirected into the bubble, but the health pool of it is so large, it's likely you won't actually break it. And as you know from the first boss, if you don't break the bubble in time, it can potentially one-shot the raid. So really you'll want to avoid using it throughout the entire fight, and if you must use it right at the end and make sure the boss dies before it even detonates. As for the healer relic in this phase, you should ignore using it and keep avoiding the Oblivion Tears. And as for the DPS relic, you shouldn't really need to use it at all. This does mean you're going to have a shitload of Undying Guardians up towards the end of the fight, but providing the tanks use their cooldowns properly with a gift cast and do a bit of kiting here and there, we didn't really find the adds to be too much of an issue. And if you are still struggling with it, then you'll want to time the DPS relic so it doesn't overlap with the Piercing Eyes or the gift cast. But that's pretty much it for this phase. You've just got to stack up, move from the patches and the eyes, don't kill each other, and nuke the boss with lust when your 3-minute cooldowns come back. And just hope you can kill him before the Insatiable Torment goes on too many targets and just becomes too overwhelming for your healers.
If you'd like to know more about this encounter or would like a quick recap before you go back into your raid, then do check out our written guide over on Wowhead. A link for that can be found in the description below. Thank you very much for watching, guys, and we'll catch you next week in Mythic.
Thanks for watching.
Thanks for watching.